of Nebraska, but I'm also chair of the Community Trust and Assurance Board, and we've been talking for the last few months about baseline expectations and how we're moving forward with the InCommon community to develop some new standards for how we trust each other and what we see as the vision for our future federation. And so today, this is actually part 3 of our Baseline Expectations webinar series. We've had a long haul here, and I'm glad that all of you were able to join us today. Joining me is Ann West from InCommon and Internet 2, and also Sean Reynolds. If Sean can get dialed in. Sean is the CIO in Northwestern, also the chair of our InCommon Steering Committee, and we're really grateful to have Sean with us to offer some insights on the CIO perspective of the benefits of baseline expectations from the seat of the CIO. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I've got a little agenda here that we can go over. Oh, as I mentioned, this is the third in our 3-part series. It feels like we've been talking about this for quite a while. Dean has been grateful to record and then post the recordings of all of the previous webinars on the InCommon website. So if you haven't caught those are great introductions first to baseline expectations and the impact to you and the benefits for the end users. The second one was metadata health checks, myself and Nick Roy primarily, talking about automated health checks, those emails that some of you may have been receiving last month, talking about our metadata and how we can try and meet the new baseline expectations. And this webinar, where we're going to be talking about policy aspects, the legal changes, explaining that it is more than just the health checks and metadata. What are the other aspects, and how do we involve the community in where baseline expectations is going? So with that, we've got a little bit of an agenda. Here are the items we're going to be covering today in this webinar. First, we're going to go back and review what are the baseline expectations. Second, Sean Reynolds, why is this important from the CIO perspective? And will then take us through what has changed and what will be changing for the InCommon community. And then I'll follow up towards the end there with the community processes and how are we incorporating the community into baseline expectations, and so that this is a community-driven set of standards and how we will handle moving that standard forward, interpreting decisions about baseline expectations, and handling any disputes between participants. We'll end with our timeline and roadmap, which has a number of items related to the community, InCommon Steering, the Community Trust and Assurance Board, as well as participants and InCommon operations. So those are the items that we're going to be covering today. So first off, what are the baseline expectations? First, we'll start with the identity provider baseline expectations. And the basic one is that we're going to be eating our own dog food here. And we should trust that the IDP that we're running is good enough to access our own environments. Generally accepted security practices are applied to the IDP, and related to that metadata health check webinar, that our metadata that we provide about our identity providers is accurate and complete and has a number of specific items included in it. We talked about that last month, and thanks to Nick for monitoring and providing some updated stats. I think he's going to post an updated blog post soon, if he hasn't already, just mentioning some of the stats and where we're at. We've gone, I think we've doubled just within the last few weeks, the number of entities that are meeting those basic metadata health checks. So great job. Moving on to the service provider baseline expectations, we want to focus on privacy and make sure that the information is not going to be shared. So there are a couple of items in the baseline expectations for service providers that relate to that we have controls in place to secure the information and maintain user privacy. Information received from IDPs, i.e. attributes, is not shared with third parties without permission. Generally accepted security practices, again, are applied to the service provider. And this metadata requirement. Service providers also have to make sure that their metadata is accurate. And then the last one here, making sure that the attributes that are required for the service are actually known. This is an issue with a number of services where it's not clear which attributes that they need in order for the user to successfully access it. Making sure that that is announced and available within the metadata can help us with that user experience. So those are the service provider baseline expectations. The third one here is the federation operator. And for us, this is InCommon. And what are they going to do to meet their baseline expectations? The first one here, focus on trustworthiness. That is the primary objective, and being transparent. Generally accepted security practices, again, good practices are followed to ensure accuracy and authenticity of metadata. Frameworks that improve the trustworthiness of the federation, such as entity categories, are implemented, and that they promote the adoption of those entity categories by their members. And also, this isn't just focused on InCommon. We want this set of minimum standards to be adopted across the entire globe, all of the federations. And so this last one is important as well. Work with relevant federation operators to promote the realization of baseline expectations. We hope that this is not something just contained within the United States borders or InCommon's federation. We'd like this to apply to the entire global community of federation. All right, so with that, as an introduction, I think it's also helpful for us to think about what are the benefits of, not from the technical perspective, which that's a lot of my background. My background is in technical as an IDP operator, running an IDP for an institution and having users log in using my IDP. I think it would be good, and Anne reached out to Sean to see if we could get a CIO perspective on what are the benefits of baseline expectations from their perspective. So Sean, I don't know if you're on, but would you help us walk through this one?
Yeah, hi Brett, thank you. You know, so even before I get to that slide, you know, we all get why federation is so important to our researchers or our scholars with the increased use of whether it's instrumentation or infrastructure, you know, beyond our campuses. And, you know, the thought of separate credentialing for all of these systems and the impact on the researcher or the facility holder, whoever it might be, you know, you really wonder how something like the gravitational wave group might have been able to get to where they got to if they had all kinds of extra bureaucracy in terms of navigation to get to their resources, whether it was instruments or computational or collaboration tools. So I think we all get why it's important, but why are the baseline expectations important within that context? And I think that we'd all agree that the experience needs to be easy to use, and to be easy to use, it needs to be consistent for the researchers or the scholars. We need to have up-to-date information. If something goes wrong, how can we provide assistance? So that metadata has to be there so that we can contact people to troubleshoot. We need to trust each other. And we need to ensure that we're doing what we promised to do. So there needs to be some sort of baseline that we measure against. We need to ensure that people understand how their privacy is being protected, whether that's by the identity provider or the service provider. And then finally, the last one there that Brett spoke about earlier is we need to ensure that the IDP is trusted trusted such that we would use it on our own campuses. So, you know, that these set of expectations just really ensure that attribute release can get maximized as we go forward. So, Anne, I think I'm turning to you to talk about what has changed.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, those are really great points. So, and as Brett was mentioning earlier, there were 2 previous webinars talking about kind of the background of baseline expectations, and last time we talked about the metadata changes. What I'm going to be speaking primarily about is what you will be seeing shortly in terms of the policy and the legal changes. So as part of baseline expectations, you probably, if you've been a part of InCommon for a while, or if you're just new and coming up to speed, you'll know that there's a participant operational practices requirement in the legal and in our Federation operating policies and practices document. What this did is, what this used to do, I should say, is provide the basis for trust across the Federation. And the idea was transparency. You fill out a form, tell everybody what you do, and you post it on your website. So the idea is that all of your federating partners would read that document and say, yeah, you're trustworthy. We're gonna federate with you. Well, as we all know, that really doesn't scale well. So part of the baseline expectations is to raise all boats and to have a set of common understandings about how we're going to operate ourselves and operate amongst ourselves, that then can increase over time and increase the trust over time. So what does this mean for the policies and practices? So you will shortly be receiving, at least your executive, your legal and business contacts, will be receiving an update about how the Federation operating policies and practices, which is our primary root policy document, and the InCommon Participation Agreement, which is the legal agreement that you all signed, your organization signed to become part of InCommon, have changed to reflect 2 things in particular. One is the removal of the participant operational practices requirement and the inclusion now of baseline expectations. So that's one major theme that you'll see. The second one is a new dispute resolution process that's been formalized. So part of baseline expectations is all boats will rise, right? We mentioned that. But a second thing is the community is going to work with itself to police itself. And of course, InCommon Operations will help with that. But if you are working with, say, an identity provider, and that organization is not being responsive to you with respect to their support of research and scholarship, for example, and they're not adhering to the policy in your eyes, your interpretation of policy, and they're not responding to your ability to get action, you can submit a dispute through InCommon, and that will be reviewed by the staff and the SeaTab. And Brett will talk in much more detail about how that's going to work across the community. So in addition to having an InCommon operational dispute resolution process, so if you have an issue with InCommon, you can submit a dispute in the same way, and that will go to staff and then likely up to steering. This one will be resolved with a process with your peer review and publishing, and then if needed, that will go up to steering, InCommon steering for final review, because the new dispute resolution process has teeth. So if an organization is not doing what they need to be doing, it's reviewed by your peers. There may be a recommendation sent to steering by SeaTab to actually remove the metadata, a particular policy indicator tag like research and scholarship from an entity's metadata. So this has teeth. And we're looking to work with you on making processes that reasonably review that, enforce it, and then we hope if that has to happen for a particular organization, that organization's metadata or tag can be reinstated at a later date, assuming they follow the process to get reinstated. So all of this is changing, and it's going to be reflected in these 90-day notice period that we will be starting here shortly. So once the 90-day notice period starts, what that is a notice to you, the community, that the participation agreement is changing in these particular items that I listed on the slide for all participants that have signed the legal agreement. Federation operation policies and practices will also be changing. The community will have 90 days to respond and review these two documents. At the end of that 90 days, the participant baseline expectations will be in place. So that will likely be mid-June. The date, we'll announce the date also in the 90-day notice when that starts. So it really, the exact date depends on the exact date we send out the 90-day notice. So I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions about the legal changes. Doesn't look like there are, but we can always go back if there are. And so what I think we'll do is hand this over to Brett to talk a little bit about these community-supported processes. Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Ann. You know, your comment about the POP is an interesting one, and it just reminds me of how long we've been working on this and working with the community to develop these baseline expectations. I think it was Jacob Farmer from Indiana and Paul Kasky when he was at Texas, I believe. They held a session at TechX in 2015 called Pop Killers Anonymous. And they were discussing some of the very issues that we're finally seeing some realization of. And so we've been involving the InCommon community in these discussions for about 2.5 years, I would say, starting back with that first session, Pop Killers Anonymous at TechX. We've developed a lot of these documents through community consultation, which typically takes about 6 weeks. We work on them within our InCommon advisory committees, whether it's the TAC or whether it's the Assurance Advisory Committee, now SeaTab. We work on those documents. We take them to the community at our regular community events like Global Summit and Tech Exchange, and we do community consultations and webinars. And thanks to Dean again for posting all of those online. We've had a long ramp up for baseline expectations, and if it feels like it's taken us years to get here, it has. That's because it has. And we're working with the community to define these standards and ensure that we have a community supporting them. So with that, I wanted to just talk a little bit about these community-supported processes and what do we have in baseline expectations that is going to allow the community to participate in what baseline expectations means and if they have a concern about baseline expectations. So I am the chair of the Community Trust and Assurance Board, and as I mentioned, this was formed out of the AAC, the Assurance Advisory Committee. Previously, the AAC was focused on just the InCommon Assurance Program, our bronze and silver profiles, and we noticed that the community needed a different way of expressing trust and how to elevate trust, that raise all boats, as Ann had mentioned. We began working on these baseline expectations as an alternative to the bronze and silver profiles, and now we're working to get them into the hands of the entire community and raise all those boats. I wanted to just mention, though, that the SeaTab contains members from our community, and these members were nominated by our community And we actually modified the charter to be a little broader in membership to ensure that we had everyone within InCommon represented. We conducted a consultation on the charter, and we then submitted that charter, the revised charter, to InCommon steering. But on that membership note, we wanted to expand what the AAC had before, which was focused on the assurance program, and bring a board to the InCommon community that was representative of as many members as possible. And so in the memberships, under the SeaTab charter, in the membership section, you'll see that we have outlined universities and colleges, large and small, research and scholarly communities, commercial service providers, large and small, IT and IT security, strategic leadership, IAM and information security operations individuals, international perspective, internal audit, and InCommon staff. So we've tried to incorporate all of those aspects of our community in this SeaTab, Community Trust and Assurance Board. So this board will be helping facilitate all of these community processes for baseline expectations. And the two that I'm going to go into detail today are the community consensus process, how we answer a question of whether or not something meets baseline expectations. And the second one, what do we do if there's a dispute, if someone has a disagreement with another participant's operations or how they're operating within the Federation? So those are the two aspects that we're going to talk about today. And I've got some, I apologize if I bore you all with my flow charts, but I think it helps explain what we're working on here. The first one I'm going to talk about is the community consensus process. And really it begins with the community raising an issue, asking a question. Does this meet baseline expectations? The SeaTab will facilitate that discussion, calling in subject matter experts. So if it's a security issue, we may call in a specific security expert that understands that item, and working with the community to help that discussion move along and drive it towards consensus. Now, as you're probably aware, trying to get consensus on a mailing list is difficult. And occasionally, the folks that yell the loudest are the ones that get their way. So the SeaTab has been working through what a repeatable process might be for achieving that consensus and making sure that it's representative of the entire community. But the outcome of that consensus will be one of three options. We'll be providing the provisional guidance and then do a consultation and then publish those recommendations. The second option would be, let's say that an issue that was raised is more appropriately handled within another profile or an entity category. A good example of this might be the multi-factor interoperability profile. That may be an outcome of one of the consensus decisions. And then the third option there, suggesting changes to baseline expectations. So let's say we have our baseline expectations version 1. We may eventually have a version 2. And this diagram here outlines what this process would look like. So in the upper left is where we would start. A question for this consensus is raised. The SeaTab will review those questions and then determine whether or not we need a consensus decision to be answered on that question. If we decide that there is a need to come to consensus on this for the entire community, we're going to be creating wiki pages with an entire framework of related content for holding permanently the discussion that was had around this process, around this specific consensus decision. In the first phase, we're going to be notifying all the participants that we have a consensus topic, inviting the community to ask and answer any questions about this particular topic. Once we have all of the questions and answers sort of answered and we feel like we have a really good description of what the problem is, we also will call for alternative solutions to getting this consensus, or answering the question of consensus on this item. And with that, the SeaTab will also be posting information and then asking for a question and answer period. Once we've received all those questions and answers and gone through all of them, we'll be updating the wiki pages along the way as well. We will provide an initial resolution, which is a recommendation, and then we will have another round of question and answers. And then once we've finalized all of those and have that question and answer period, the SeaTab will publish their final position, which will be one of those 3 outcomes. We'll be providing guidance on baseline expectations and then begin the community consultation process, recommending that we spin off a profile or a separate working group to handle this further, or adding it to the change log for the next version of baseline expectations. All 3 of those outcomes will eventually be communicated through the InCommon Trust and Identity newsletter, and Dean can correct me. I know that the name of the newsletter has changed recently, but we intend to notify the community through those regular communication processes. And the SeaTab, this Community Trust and Assurance Board, which has representation from our community in all of those various areas of our community, various aspects of our community, large and small, identity providers, service providers, research consortia, etc., will have the responsibility of helping us shepherd the community through this consensus process. Are there any questions on the community consensus process? Or also any clarifying comments that Anne, you want to make, or Tom Barton?
Great graphic.
Well, thank you. And there's a link to the full diagram, and Dean also will be sharing the slides. So I don't expect everyone to just dive right into these and have questions immediately. Feel free to take a look at them and submit any questions you have to the SeaTab. We'd be grateful to have any of your feedback. So the next item we want to talk about is the community dispute resolution process. And this is the process that we will follow when we have a participant that has a concern about another participant's operations. This process has 3 stages, and the intent of each of these stages is to make sure that we are doing everything we can to ensure the trust of the Federation, and we're not doing anything that's going to surprise anyone. We shouldn't, this is not intended to be sort of a gotcha moment. We're not going to be pulling people out of the Federation because they don't meet baseline expectations within a short time frame or without them knowing. We want to make sure that everyone is aware of what's happening with the community, because if you're relying on a participant that's inside the Federation, it can affect you and your users. So we want to make sure that everyone in the community is aware of what the impact might be if we do get to these stages. So the first stage really is peer-to-peer, and it would be best if the participant reaches out directly to the other participant and can resolve this amongst themselves. That's the ideal situation. And that goes back to the metadata, making sure that we have accurate contact information. Without having accurate contact information, we can't even facilitate peer-to-peer communication. So this relates also to that metadata requirement. We need to have accurate contact information in order to support peer-to-peer communication. And the ideal is that everything would be resolved there. If there is a dispute, and perhaps you can't get in contact with the other participant, you can raise that up to InCommon Operations, and InCommon Operations will help facilitate some of that. And then the third stage is the formal review process. So if InCommon Operations hasn't been able to resolve this by helping facilitate the communication, they can elevate it, and the users even, any of those participants that are in that dispute, can opt to raise it up to this formal review process by the Community Trust and Assurance Board. And that would follow a public docket review where we would have a list of all of the items that are up for SeaTab's review. The SeaTab will review that material, pull in experts, impanel some participants from the community to assist with this process, and then make a recommendation to InCommon Steering. And that recommendation may be that we alter someone's metadata or remove them from the Federation. And as Ann mentioned, making sure that we know what the reinstatement process looks like so that that participant isn't left out in the cold. So if we have to remove someone, it should be very clear what the expectations are of our community and what that entity needs to do to get back into the Federation. So with that, we can kind of walk through these three stages: the first stage, second stage, and the third stage. The first stage is, as I mentioned, this is just peer-to-peer. The concerned party tries to contact the participant directly, and ideally the issue is resolved right there, and we don't have to go any further. If this can't be solved through the peer-to-peer, then this will move on to the second stage. And the second stage is where we have InCommon operations assisting us. And the user will then contact email InCommon support. InCommon support will determine first, is this an incident? And what I mean by that is this a security incident that we need to act on immediately? InCommon has an incident response procedure that was published, I think it was last year. And that process will be followed if this is an incident, a security incident. If it's not a security incident, let's say it's just a concern that goes directly between these two parties, they'll determine if it has merit, and if it doesn't have merit, they'll let the concerned party know, say, this really isn't an issue, and they can end right there. If it does have merit, though, they'll open a ticket, begin recording all of the information about this, including the dates and the relevant concerned party's contact information. They will begin trying to contact those participants to try and resolve this. Ideally, InCommon operations and with their help, they can resolve this. If both parties are then satisfied that we don't need to move any further, then we can close the ticket, just record that we assisted in a dispute resolution and InCommon operations was able to help to resolve that. If not, if both of the parties aren't satisfied and either party wishes to escalate it, then it will move into that third stage. The third stage is where we have the SeaTab's public docket review, recommendations optionally sent on to InCommon Steering, and if InCommon Steering accepts any recommendations to remove or alter metadata, then we will begin that notification process, notifying the community of the intent to alter metadata. And this relates to the docket. And the docket is a set of documents that will notify and allow the community to see what the SeaTab is currently reviewing. Now, depending on the issue, the details may not be, shared. Let's say it's a security incident. We may not want to wave a flag about a security incident between a participant until we know all the details and have a little better understanding of what's going on. But we'll at least be able to say, these are the entities that SeaTab is currently reviewing in their docket. So the docket will list the entities that SeaTab will be reviewing. Let's jump into this docket review process by SeaTab. So again, we have the members of SeaTab, which are nominated from the community. They will determine, is this specific item on the docket, is this a baseline expectations violation? If it's not, if they determine in the SeaTab sole discretion, if it is not, they will ask InCommon operations to notify that concerned party that it's not baseline expectations. If it is a violation of baseline expectations, the SeaTab will notify that participant and let them know that they are up for formal review. And a period of time will occur here. And I don't know that we have a specific time frame that we're targeting, but we want to make sure that the participant has an opportunity to respond and resolve the issue. And if we are in direct communication, let's say the participant just needs a little bit of time to go through their change control process, to upgrade something or put some all changes into place, that we want to be flexible about those operations, about the timing. If the issue can then be resolved, then we're going to end. If not, and we cannot bring this to resolution, we have to make a recommendation to InCommon Steering. Then SeaTab will write up in their recommendation and then pass that along to InCommon Steering for their approval. And as I mentioned before, so SeaTab will update the ticket and provide a recommendation to Steering. This also will include the reinstatement process for that particular entity for what they need to do in order to get back into the Federation. We'll pass those recommendations on to Steering. InCommon Steering will accept it or reject it and close the ticket. If InCommon Steering accepts the recommendation to remove or alter metadata, we will begin a process to notify the community that we intend to alter that metadata in the future. This process is what we will follow to notify our community. InCommon is going to update these items in the public docket with their current status. InCommon Operations and the Vice President and Associate Vice President of Trust and Identity will notify the exec contact at the participant. We also want to make sure that the community, everyone in the community is aware. We'll publish the InCommon newsletter. Wait again until we have another opportunity to publish a newsletter. And if it has been resolved, then we can close the ticket and end. If it hasn't been resolved, then we're going to alter the metadata and then publish that we altered the metadata in the InCommon newsletter. So there's a long process here that is followed. And the intent here is to make sure that we've got everything, all our T's crossed, all our I's dotted, and we're doing everything we can to work with that participant and ensure that they're in compliance with baseline expectations and being a full member of the Federation. But these are the teeth that Ann mentioned. And we have a very well-structured process that we're going to be walking through when we encounter one of these, if we have to, which will eventually end up in potentially altering or removing an entity from the Federation. So what type of disputes and what type of issues will we encounter? Here are a few that we've thought about. And the SeaTab will be continuing to provide some community guidance on these items. But the first one here we've encountered already. People have already asked us, what should be in a good privacy policy? So referring to that metadata element, what needs to be inside my privacy policy for my service provider or for my identity provider? This is a question that the SeaTab will be wrestling with and providing some guidance on to the community. So over the next 90 days, we're not going to stay silent. We're not going to just sit back. We're going to continue to develop guidance to the community around items such as this. Another question that may be raised, and we will have to answer soon, is does some specific item mean generally accepted security practices? And that item may be how quickly you're patching a security vulnerability, or if you have support for some older TLS ciphers, something like that. We fully anticipate to be getting some of those questions, and I'm sure folks within the community already have some of those questions. Right now, my recommendation would be to talk to your campus security experts and work with them, get their opinions on what meets your generally accepted security practices. That would be a good course of action for anyone. Just reach out to your local security folks and ask them about it. But if we do need to come to consensus, let's say the community can't decide and the community doesn't have the answers themselves, and we need to pull the answers out of the community and arrive at consensus, then we will go through that community consensus process to answer that question about X in particular. And also related to that, the contact information, making sure that we've got the appropriate people making sure that we have contacts so that we can reach out. I also mentioned impaneling some experts to help us in a community dispute resolution. So let's say there's a dispute and it's in regards to some specific security issue. We may need to pull in a security expert. The maintenance processes for baseline expectations outline the process of impaneling some experts, and those experts may be pulled from our community. So we may be looking within our Federation metadata to find some specific members through those security contacts that would be willing to help us if we had a need for pulling in some additional expertise or additional members from our community to guide what the SeaTab is working through.
So Brett, there's a question, I think a little bit of a discussion going on in the chat room right now about, does each SP we have need a separate privacy policy, or can we have one for our entire domain? So Nick Roy from InCommon suggested you can have one for the entire org, but you need to have it individually apply. You need to apply it for each entity descriptor for each service provider. Do you have any thoughts about that, Brett?
Yeah, I know that the answer to this may be very specific to your individual application. So I will mention that we have on our SeaTab Mary Catherine Martinez, and I don't know if she's with us today. I don't know if she's able to join us, but Mary Catherine is with a service provider, a commercial service provider that offers services to institutions. Some of those service providers are hosted by them, software as a service out in the cloud, and then there are other instances where they're on-prem and the individual institutions are actually operating those. So the privacy policy may depend on that specific installation. I don't know that we're going to have a one-size-fits-all recommendation there, but what I've asked David Bantz in particular, and he's a member from of the SeaTab from the University of Alaska, as well as Chris Whalen, and I don't know if we've got either of them on.
They're both on the call, actually, on the webinar.
Yeah, so I've asked both of them to start thinking about this, and I think you're exactly right. Getting some guidance on these privacy policies is going to be important because there are many service providers who don't have that. I don't think there's any problem with having a single privacy policy for an entire top-level domain. But as I mentioned, it may depend on your specific implementations. So I'm grateful for David's analysis that he's already done. He's already looked at some of the privacy policies that are out there, and I think we will hopefully have some good recommendations within the next month or so that we'll be able to share with the community on, what does a good privacy policy look like? What are the things that you should be thinking about? If you don't have one, who should you talk to on your campus? Who should you reach out to help develop that? Those are the items that I want to be able to provide to the community. Those answers so that we can guide them to getting a privacy policy established. I don't know if that helps, Dan, or I'll look in the chat. Does that help?
Yes, Dan says yes.
All right. Well, Dan, if you have any wisdom to share on that, please share it with us, because I know we're all going to be working towards this as we try and meet those baseline expectations.
Right. And so another question that we've heard also from organizations that are looking to support baseline is the whole logo issue. And I know that the SeaTab has it on our list to look at that. The logo is really important for the consistent user experience. And Sean, I'm going to call on you in a second too to kind of about steering's role on this and what your thoughts are about what I was saying in particular with respect to teeth. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the logo. So the logo, my understanding, Brad, is really important because, when an end user connects to a service provider and gets routed back to the identity provider for the for the authentication and the attributes and all that good stuff, right? That whole interface, that whole transition, it would be good if the end user sees both where they're going to, so a logo for the IDP, and a logo for the service provider where they're coming from, and vice versa. So it helps really manage that transition. So does that mean is the logo going to be used anywhere else? Or, I've heard from some schools that they have folks that are a little bit nervous about putting a logo in the metadata. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was looking back through the stats. I was trying to find them, and maybe Nick has them right at his fingertips. But I was trying to think about InCommon and where we have logos for IDPs, and these stats are as of I think it was March 1st. For IDPs, we have about 50%. About 50% of IDPs have a logo, and having an IDP logo helps the users navigate when they get to one of those discovery interfaces, and it says, like the where are you from discovery page that allows the user to find their institution. Having that logo be immediately recognizable helps the user find their IDP inside those interfaces. That's a scenario where we're seeing inconsistency right now, with only 47% or about 50% of our IDPs that have logos. That leads to a somewhat broken user experience. But on the SP side, it is much worse. It is only about 25% for service providers that have a logo. So this is another area where we've got to provide some guidance or some suggestions. And I think, Ann, your comment about user experience is really important. Having the users see something that they recognize that gives them confidence that they're logging into the right service, they know what it is, that will be helpful. The scenario that you mentioned, where the user is going to access a service provider, they're redirected back to the IDP. The IDP, if we have consistent information from service providers, such as a logo, we can incorporate that into not only the IDP login process, but into any consent interfaces as well, so that the users are aware you are sending your attributes to this service provider, and having a logo is going to be helpful in that communication process. So my suggestions right now, if you're at an institution that has a marketing or a communications department, I would reach out to them. I would ask them what their thoughts are on creating logos for service providers. And in the terminology that I'm familiar with, I worked with the communication folks. What I'm going to be asking the communication folks at Nebraska for is a lockup. And the lockup means it's a logo and the text in the correct font and spacing that is associated with that. Those two elements together are called a lockup. And this is helpful. You've probably seen all these examples where you have your institutional logo, and then right next to it you have the department name or the college name in the correct font and then the correct spacing. I would reach out to your communications folks and ask them about creating a lockup for service providers so that you can create one if a service doesn't have a service-specific logo. Now, there's another few scenarios that you can imagine with service providers. So let's say we have a software as a service, and that software is commercially recognized as some other name. The commercial service provider may have a logo that they can provide to you, but your campus may have branded it something else. I don't know what the best answer is in that situation, but my suggestion would be to put yourself in the shoes or at the keyboard of an end user as they're going through this login process. What is going to help inform them about where they're logging into and where their attributes are being released to? So as Ann mentioned, Tom Barton and I have been working on an arc of work for SeaTab over the next few months, and included in that is privacy policy, working through these community dispute resolution. We're going to be doing some tabletop exercises, actually. We're walking through a couple of these. And Also, logo recommendations and how can we provide some community guidance on what to do for logos. And as we continue to send out these health checks to all the site admins, we're going to be monitoring these stats and seeing where our community is having trouble. So the stats will help guide what we need to work on. The two that we have identified immediately are these privacy policies and logos, but it may be that security contact is something that we need to tackle as well. So we'll be monitoring those stats and seeing where our community needs additional guidance over the next few months. So I would encourage you all to stay in tune with the Baseline Expectations homepage. And Dean, I think you can share that link with everyone. Right now it's focused mainly on the webinars, but we hope to begin sharing more information through that site, specifically about these items that I've mentioned.
And I think also the beginning of the 90-day notice will start in the next couple of weeks. And we'll make sure to announce the date when that starts. And the end of that 90-day notice period for the legal change will then be the effective date of baseline expectations. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ann. I wanted to mention that we've got a slide here about the timeline and next steps, and maybe we can share that with the community to talk through what you just mentioned, that 90-day period, as well as some of the other upcoming items.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think we have about 7 minutes left, and I just want to also have give Sean the mic a bit to have him provide some thoughts from the steering perspective, InCommon steering perspective about baseline. Sean?
Sorry, mute issue. No, I think where I have to start on this is just to really thank the whole team that's been putting this together. It's been, Brett has talked about the journey, and it's been an incredible amount of work, and I believe that it's really going to strengthen the Federation, having people consistently applying some of these activities or actions. So, we're very cognizant of the fact that there's quite a gap today relative to where we need to get to in terms of adherence to the baseline expectations. But the whole conversation to date, it's been very rational in terms of how we'll close those gaps. That's not to say that at some point, tough conversations might have to be had, if people aren't participating as a good Federation citizen, if you will. But I think this is just going to, the whole community, identity providers, service providers, the organization is going to be so much better off with all this work. So thanks to everybody involved.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I agree. It's a lot of work on everybody's part, and those on this call and those aren't on this call. So everybody's got to pitch in to kind of move the boats up and increase the public health in general of InCommon. So Brett, why don't you take us through the timeline here?
Yeah, and thanks to Tom Barton for working on this diagram here, this roadmap. We've got essentially swim lanes grouped by color of each of the different audiences that are helping with baseline expectations. Each of these individual projects or timelines have some descriptions on the full roadmap page, so I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Right now, I would say we're right at this big milestone marker, which is the red line about in the middle there. And really that will be, Ann mentioned, notification coming out within the next couple of weeks to the community about the new participation agreement and the new FOP. So that's kind of where we're at. Each of the swim lanes here represents a different audience. The green is the participants, the yellow is the Community Trust and Assurance Board, the orange is steering, and the blue is InCommon, meaning InCommon operations. So for participants, we're right at the stage where this will be the reading through the new participation agreement, what the changes are to incorporate baseline expectations into the participation agreement, and giving you an opportunity to take a look at that. There are a number of items on InCommon's plate, and Nick Roy mentioned just the beginning of that when he talked about the health checks last month, and there's a lot of other items, in particular for the Federation manager to incorporate baseline expectations and these requirements into the Federation manager. So InCommon has a lot of items that they will be working on, including communication out to the participants in the InCommon community, but also the operationalizing baseline expectations. So every single one of these has a little bit more detailed description. I'd encourage you all to take a look at some of that. Feel free to take a look at the roadmap and then post any questions that you have there. And as Ann mentioned, this change, baseline expectations, will raise the InCommon Federation from a metadata repository into the most trusted resource for identities and collaborative services in academia. That's the goal. That's really what's driving us with baseline expectations. It's improving access and the usefulness of this federation so that we can eliminate those barriers. And as Sean was mentioning in his CIO perspective comments, just the challenges of accessing services and collaborating in academia, it is really challenging if we don't have these aspects, if we don't have our federation working well. And that's the goal of baseline expectations. Let's elevate our federation and make it the most useful resource in academia. So with that, that's the end of our three-part series. Thanks everyone for joining us today. As we mentioned before, the recordings are going to be available. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and added the link there to our baseline homepage, which has a number of links that go off of it to all of the resources that we've mentioned, including those that have been up for community consultation. And we'll begin communication here soon about the new participation agreement and ramping up all of that communication. So with that, Ann, thank you very much for your help today, and thank you, Sean, for participating and your leadership on InCommon steering. It's been a long process, and there's been a lot of hands that have helped us to where we're at today, but I know that within the next 90 days, we're going to be a better federation because of it. So with that, back to you, Dean.
Okay, very good, Brett. Thank you. And we're at the top of the hour, so thanks for another excellent webinar, Brett. And thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.